Pope Francis is, as you've heard, on a big multi-day trip to Indonesia. I expect I'll be talking about this for a few days because seemingly every single day of his trip so far, he opens his mouth and weird stuff just comes out of it. As an example, as was pointed out in the live chat for this stream before we went live, he met with the clergy of Indonesia and told them not to proselytize. Proselytize is his favorite word for denigrating the spreading of the gospel. Said we're all supposed to get along and have a big group hug sort of relationship with people who follow functionally Satan. They follow a religion we can't critique or even mention by name on this platform because we get into big trouble. And I know that from experience because it happened to me once. So we're going to go over some more of the weird stuff that he's been saying. The through line in his trip is secularism and materialism, especially. Pope Francis has a secular issue he's pushing and signed an agreement about with the local leader of a false, we'll call it theology on. We'll call that issue the thermometer problem. It's another one of those issues that are totally fair and totally freedom respecting hosts have explicitly said you're not allowed to question the narrative on their platform. And if you do, you lose your channel. And I've seen a lot of channels get destroyed over this. So we'll just call it what we just called it. So we'll call it that. The thermometer problem. Or if you prefer, the problem involving how to having way too much of the most abundant element in the universe in the air. That element, by the way, is carbon. It makes up literally everything you touch, and if you get too much of it in the air, it can cause problems you see only on the thermometer. Or so we're told by the same people who lied to us about literally everything else. I don't know how much you trust them on that issue. I don't, and I studied it for my doctoral dissertation. We actually had to read a lot of those scientific papers, and I'll just say this. Yeah, there's a lot of problems in those field of studies. But anyway, Pope Francis has gone all in on that issue. He issued in 2016 Laudato Si, on care for our common home, as he called it. Last year, in October, he issued Laudato Deum. It was actually issued on the free feast of St. Francis of Assisi. Both of those documents are about that issue, and they authorize Catholics to support authoritarian measures to achieve the stated goals of our secular rulers. The documents are, to put it bluntly, evil, because they're dedicated to propagating a diabolical lie. But let's start here. Pope Francis urged believers of these competing religions to adopt at least one of the values of the French Revolution. And so we go to Vatican News. You can't see the headline here, but I want you to be able to see what we're going to go read from, at least starting here. But the headline is Pope at Mass in Indonesia. Dare to dream of fraternity. On the third day of his apostolic journey to Indonesia, Pope Francis celebrates Mass in Jakarta and reminds the faithful of the need to listen to and live the word proclaimed by Jesus. Now that, from the headline, sounds like a good message. Live the word, live and proclaim the word of Jesus. Until you see how he's actually framing it. See, the values of the French Revolution are liberty, equality, and fraternity. Pope Francis has used the language of the French Revolution for years, but here he's equating fraternity with the gospel. Fraternity means a group of people sharing common interests or proposals. That's the most basic definition of it. In the French Revolution, it was the way you described others dedicated to the revolution. Another synonym for fraternity is camaraderie, or if you prefer, you would call someone dedicated to the same cause as you, your comrade. That's not a coincidence. That's not being hyperbolic. That's what those words mean. So here's what he has to say. Quote, brothers and sisters, Pope Francis concluded, I would also like to say to you, to this nation, to this wonderful and varied archipelago, do not grow weary of setting sail and casting your nets. Do not grow weary of dreaming and building again a civilization of peace. Always dare to dream of fraternity, he continued, encouraging them to, quote, sow seeds of love, confidently tread the path of dialogue, continue to show your goodness and kindness with your characteristic smile, end quote. By now, we're all aware, dialogue is antithetical to the spreading of the gospel. He does not equate dialogue with proselytizing, or evangelizing is the more positive post-conciliar word used a lot. No, that's not what he calls it. They're not compatible characteristics. Look, there's nothing wrong with building a civilization of peace. I can even tell you how to build a civilization of peace. It's on paper the simplest thing imaginable, but also the hardest thing to do in practice for Christians, which is to call people to conversion. We've grown soft and lukewarm, even the best of us. We live in an age of lukewarmness and indifference. We as Christians like to get along. And the consequence of that is the loss of peace is one of the things, not to mention, that little problem of the salvation of souls that never gets brought into this. If you want to build a civilization of peace, you spread the gospel. You convince people of the truth of Jesus Christ, that he is the Messiah, the second person of the Holy Trinity, true God and true man. Call people to become Catholic. You do it in a pleasant way. You do it in a nice way. You don't be a jerk about it, but you go out and you do that work. And you do that enough, you convince enough people to freely, of their own free will, accept Christ and have the church teach people what that actually means in practice. And one of the things you're going to get out of the deal is a civilization of peace, which is actually at best a secondary concern anyway, to the one you don't hear me quote Francis on almost ever. And that is, again, the salvation of souls. There's precious little here about salvation, because of course not, because the church has always consistently said outside the church, there is no salvation. There are a few prelates who have tried to tell us that other religion in that country worships the same God as us. That is blasphemy. It is absolutely blasphemy. What Francis is doing is using the gospel to sell a material benefit to people. It's materialism. That's all that is. And that's really ironic because Pope Francis rightly hammers people for being materialists. But his thing when he talks about materialism is just to go after consumerism, which is only one facet of materialism. And it becomes pretty ideological and pretty clear that he's just promoting an ideology when he does that. One of the signs of materialist thinking is lukewarmness and indifference. Religious indifferentism is a sin. It's a very serious sin. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines religious indifferentism as the belief that all religions are equally good and capable of leading a person to their eternal destiny. In its most extreme form, indifferentism is the idea that no one form of religious belief, worship, or moral behavior has been revealed by God. That is what religious indifferentism is. Does Francis believe that Catholicism is the one revealed religion? Does he believe God revealed multiple religions? Or does he merely claim that the religion he's interacting with the most in Indonesia is a merely flawed way of worshiping the same God? All of those are generally errors, except for Catholicism being the one revealed religion. If you have a hard time with the fact that some decent bishops has said that other group they worship the same God in an imperfect way, I'm going to remind you of a basic thing. If you deny the Trinity, if you deny the divinity of Christ, that Jesus Christ is God, then you don't worship the same God as Catholics. It's as simple as that. This isn't rocket science. This isn't something you need some advanced degree to understand. This is how the errors of modernism have twisted the thinking of even some good bishops, otherwise good bishops, because they really want to get on this because it's the politically correct thing to do. But Francis signed a document institutionalizing this indifferentism and this lukewarmness. He did this with a bunch of fanfare in Indonesia, and we're going to go here to a Catholic news source that I don't typically like much, but they do pretty good coverage of this. And their headline for this is document fostering religious harmony for the sake of humanity. The Istiqlal Declaration, and I'm sure I said that wrong. Pope Francis and Nazaruddin Umar, the big cheese of Jakarta's Istiqlal Temple, signed a shared statement on September 5th, that'd be yesterday, during an interreligious meeting held in front of their temple. This document is essentially a lukewarm peace agreement between Catholicism and that other major belief system that originates from the Holy Land. You know, the one whose track record on violence isn't exactly great, but for some reason, you're not permitted to criticize it on these platforms. Yeah, that one. It's the dominant system in Indonesia. 87% of their population follows that. Something like 6 or 10% or something are Catholic. And I'm going to go over the whole thing for you here because it is very short. Though we do have to tread carefully because our hosts are totally fair and totally free rulers don't like some of the things that are in here, so we have to play with some of the wording. But this is pretty clear. This is what lukewarmness looks like. And remember something about how lies are sold to people. Lies are sold to people by attaching the truth to them. A lot of what you're going to hear here is absolutely true. Just remember, every single true thing in this document can be addressed with the gospel and only with the gospel. Here's the text. One, the worldwide phenomenon of dehumanization is marked especially by widespread violence and conflict, frequently leading to an alarming number of victims. It's particularly worrying that religion is often instrumentalized in this regard, causing suffering to many, especially women, children, and the elderly. The role of religion, however, should include promoting and safeguarding the dignity of every human life. The human exploitation of creation, our common home, has contributed to the thermometer problem, leading to various destructive consequences such as natural disasters, thermometer issues, and unpredictable weather patterns. This ongoing crisis of creation has become an obstacle to the harmonious coexistence of peoples. In response to these two crises, guided by our respective religious teachings and recognizing the contribution of Indonesia's philosophical principle of Pancasila, we, together with the other religious leaders present, call for the following. Religious leaders, in particular, inspired by the respective spiritual narratives and traditions, should cooperate in responding to the above mentioned crises, identifying their causes and taking appropriate action. Let's pause here. Remember, one of those is the thermometer problem. That problem caused, at least in part, by the most abundant element on the periodic table being in the air and too much of it, as well as some other things being up there. Or so we're told by people who lie to us about everything else. Right? The values shared by our religious traditions should be effectively promoted in order to defeat the culture of violence and indifference afflicting our world. Indeed, religious values should be directed towards people, promoting a culture of respect, dignity, compassion, reconciliation, and fraternal solidarity in order to overcome both dehumanization and environmental badness. Since there is a single worldwide human family, interreligious dialogue ought to be recognized as an effective instrument for resolving local, regional, and international conflicts, especially those incited by the misuse of religion. Moreover, our religious beliefs and rituals have a particular capacity to speak to the human heart and thus foster a deeper respect for human dignity. Acknowledging that a healthy, peaceful, and harmonious living creation is vital for becoming true servants of God and custodians of creation, we sincerely call on all people of goodwill to take decisive action in order to maintain the integrity of the created world and its resources, for we have inherited them from past generations and hope to pass them on to our children and grandchildren. That's the document. And that thing sounds like it was written by the same secular writers who wrote many of the documents I had to read in grad school as I was writing my doctoral dissertation on the Catholic Church's response to the thermometer problem. I had to make it much more laudatory of Pope Francis than I have ever wanted, which is one of the reasons why I've really shared it. But it reads exactly like the secular documents, written in this sort of indifferentist religious sentiment. And look, I do not disagree that people who live in these kind of places like Indonesia need to figure out how to get along. Obviously, that's the case, right? But this is taking it pretty far. Some are going to ask, what's the big deal? And it's pretty simple. Fake theologies that lead you to following Satan aren't going to save you, and they're not a path to peace. This peace they're working for is laudable. Blessed are the peacemakers. I will never countersignal that. But what's more important, the most important thing in everything, it's the first law of the church, the salvation of souls. You won't find salvation in that system that he's calling for dialogue with. You simply will not. The premise is faulty. The one family that exists around the world is Catholicism. There is no worldwide human family. We are competing groups of peoples who can overcome their competing nature if we follow Jesus' great command. Go forth and baptize all nations in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Ghost, teaching them all that Christ taught the apostles. That's how you get to an authentic worldwide family. This is just so much dross and nonsense, and it will fail to achieve its goals because every attempt to do so in other ways other than through the gospel of Christ has failed spectacularly. Partially, in this case, because one of its goals is an absolute lie pushed by seculars to justify more and more power for themselves. Now, thankfully, there have been some initial responses to this from actual Catholic leaders. And if there are more over the weekend, I will happily bring those to you. We shall see. Well, first, we start here with Vigano, who gives a particularly spicy and brief take. He posted this on Twitter. The apotheosis of fiction, the representative of a false religion and the false leader of the one true religion, signed a statement on the false thermometer problem. Thank you, Archbishop Vigano. Very, very succinct. It's succinct in what you would expect from him. He gave up being nice in his writings a long time ago. Now, Cardinal Muller kind of issued a response. It's relatively short, at least this part that I'll go over here, and it gets to the problem. We are told even by Francis that we face a hellish punishment if we don't get on board his big Laudato Si fiction. He did this, it was part of an interview he gave well before this document was made public, talking about the Synod on synodality. But there's a part of it here, a relatively small section, that is key to understanding this whole problem. So we go to Info Vaticana for this headline. Again, I'm using a translation algorithm. That's why when you check this later, you're going to see this is in Spanish. But interview with Cardinal Muller. Those who have a different opinion on the thermometer problem cannot be threatened with hellish punishments. Yeah, he's not wrong. I mean, this is a purely secular problem, one that people question for obvious reasons. Again, he's talking about here the Synod of Synodality, or the Synod of Bishops. And I'll go over his critiques of that in a future video in the coming days, maybe tomorrow. But here's something that is absolutely relevant to the document Francis is pushing on the church now. So this is from the interview. Quote, I have already explained that either there is a Synod of Bishops as an institution of the collegiality of all bishops with and under the Roman pontiff, or it is a symposium with participants from the entire people of God to exchange views on pressing issues and current challenges, to consult and also to make proposals. In no case should this assembly resemble a party conference in an authoritarian system, in which everyone is closely watched and controlled so that they speak according to the wishes of the authorities, and in which the only real ruler then decides as he sees fit. Oof, that's a great way to describe what we've seen so far. The church is not a political organization, and its constitution has nothing to do with an absolute or constitutional monarchy, with an aristocratic oligarchy, or with a libertarian or totalitarian government of the people. The church is the people of God, and each individual of Christ addresses God directly in his conscience and prayer. And bishops are appointed as pastors to teach, guide, and sanctify the people of God according to the heart of Jesus. The church is the sacrament of the salvation of the world in Christ. It also contributes to the common good and to social justice and peace in the world by admonishing the powerful and praying for them. But it is no direct political task and takes into account the relative autonomy of the subject areas. I know a lot of you are rolling your eyes at that quote because he is quoting verbatim Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 36, a Vatican II document, one of, if not the most controversial document from Vatican II. We cannot sanction one legitimate opinion in favor of another with spiritual punishments on the subject of the thermometer problem, compulsory acceptance of the satanic solution to the 2020 affliction. Yeah, he went there. And the issue of large amounts of people moving from one place to another. Just as the ecclesiastical authority cannot institute new sacraments, it cannot invent new mortal sins. Certainly, one cannot seriously threaten with hellish punishments those who have an opinion on the thermometer problem involving that abundant element different from that of the majority. And mostly, quote, that is such a good interview that I'll have to cover it in the coming days because the synod is coming and it is coming soon. And there's going to be all kinds of nonsense preached there with the stated goal of the synod to change the Catholic faith, to bring it up to date, even though they tried that 60 years ago and it didn't seem to work. That's why they talk about the synodal church, whatever the synodal church is. But you can see here in this diabolical document signed by Pope Francis, just more materialist nonsense wrapped up in some pious sounding language that does a very bad job of hiding the fact that this is a lukewarm document built on indifferentism and institutionalizing indifferentism. Remember, Pope Francis told the clergy, Catholic clergy of Indonesia, not to, quote, proselytize, which is just a negative sounding word to describe spreading the gospel, evangelization, which is one of the principal jobs of the church, by the way. And anytime he does invoke the gospel, he talks about it in ways here and in anywhere else, really, where he talks about the here and now. He talks about the material, this life, and making this life as great as it possibly can be, and rarely, if ever, in the eternal. Very rarely do we hear about the consequences of sin from most of our pastors. Those of you who go to traditional parishes are totally exempted from that, obviously, because traditional priests, even ones who are kind of middling, are light years better than most anybody else on this. They will at least preach the four last things a couple times a year. I'm not saying you need to hear it every Sunday. Might be a little much to hear it every Sunday, but you should hear it on a semi-regular basis so that you understand what the stakes of this life are. It would be nice to hear that kind of thing from Pope Francis. But unfortunately, we are unlikely to ever hear about that from him. And if we do, it might be the biggest sign that he knows his days are very limited. So keep an eye on that, because eventually I think that's what you're going to see happen. But again, he signed an agreement, a lukewarm agreement backed by a command to the clergy of Indonesia not to spread the gospel, essentially. When you tell them not to proselytize, that's what you're doing. The only people who are going to hear the gospel there, hopefully, are Catholics. And I say hopefully because at least I hope they hear the gospel. These days, you never know. Kathleen France said, Jesus said these kind of problems would Jesus said these kind of problems would happen in the end times. That's true, but also, how much are we hearing is actually real? What do you think about that? I mean, how much of that is because people are tinkering with the mechanisms of creation in ways that we shouldn't be? Again, I'm not one who thinks that, we're going to see a date coming up here in the very near future that is the end all of everything. Jesus kind of commanded us not to spend too much time speculating on dates and things when it comes to the end times, just to know the signs. All right, folks. Yes, today is First Friday. Please go to your First Friday if you are planning to attend. If you've been wanting to keep the First Friday devotion, this is a good time to start. It's First Friday. Tomorrow is First Saturday. So please, if you've been wanting to start the 5 First Saturdays devotion, tomorrow is your great opportunity to do it. Now, at the beginning of the Synod on Synodality, phase 2 or 3 or whatever we're on, plus with all the political stuff going on in America and looking like it's going to start happening in other places, this is a great time to keep the 5 First Saturdays devotion. And that reminds me, I posted on the Return to Tradition Facebook page. Father Ripperger posted a prayer for the coming political contest in the United States. So go check that out if you are so interested. Sonny Jim reminds us that whenever the Roman Catholic Church dialogues with some other group or ideology, it's the church that compromises its truth, not the other side. And that is 100% accurate. You ever notice that all this dialoguing is always us giving ground? No one else. No one ever going, yeah, maybe in the aftermath of the so-called Reformation, we kind of pushed theology to past the breaking point. Maybe the solas aren't as ironclad as we like to say. We never get that. No. What we always get is the Catholic Church surrendering on all whatever issues it is, always giving ground. It is absolutely true. And it's one of the reasons why this ecumenical dialogue stuff needs to come to an end, and end sooner rather than later. Hopefully the next Pope will. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. Pray for Pope Francis. Pray for the church in Indonesia. And anybody else we mentioned in this video that you might have some negative feelings towards. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.